And we're recording. Welcome everybody to our event, Operation Hermes with Glenn Voelz. My name is Julie and I'm the events manager at Roundabout Books. And while we are in this time of not being able to have events in the store, we are so grateful that our authors and our customers and friends are joining us via Zoom right now. Our virtual events have been really fun, and I'm so happy to see so many of your faces on this event tonight. So Glenn and I are going to have a little conversation about his book, talk about it. I did want to remind everyone that the bookstore is open. If for some reason we have to alter our hours or anything like that, please always check our social media because that will be the most up to date on what's going on with COVID and restrictions in our store hours. But again, you can always call the bookstore to order a book or to have one pulled off the shelf. You can pick it up off of our red bench in the front of the store, so you can do contactless. We'll even walk them out to the back parking lot. Just always give us a call. We're here to get those books in your hands. So first, I want to tell you a little bit about this book. So Operation Hermes is the sequel to the satirical novel War Under the Mango Tree, which we had an event last year for our local author night, and that was great. So, an economic crisis and rioting in the streets threatened to topple the government of the longtime American ally. Amid the turmoil, the country's aging autocrat looks to Beijing for support, raising fears in Washington of a new superpower rivalry emerging in Africa. A mysterious assassination attempt sends rivals scrambling for advantage, each hoping to occupy the executive mansion. With the country's future hanging in the balance, American spies, diplomats, and soldiers race against time and each other to get their candidate into power. And a little bit about our author. So Glenn Voelz served for 25 years in the U.S. Army as an intelligence officer. His career included over a decade living and working overseas in Asia, the Middle East, Europe, and Africa. And I think that is where some of your inspiration for these books have come up, is your service, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But one of the things that I wanted to know, and I'm always curious about, is how was it writing a sequel different from writing the first book?
Yeah, well, let me start by just thanking you, Julie, and Roundabout Books, because you guys do a super job. You're amazing supporters of the local writing community here in Bend. And as you mentioned, this is my second event, and it's just super, everything that you do to support local authors. So in terms of writing the sequel, in one sense, it was easier in that I had a strong sense for the characters and their relationships and the setting. So it helped me see how all the plot pieces were going to fit together when I had the concept for the second book. So that aspect was a little bit easier just because I knew who I was dealing with in terms of the characters and how I wanted to have them develop in the second book. But what was much more difficult was being constrained by the decisions of the first book. So the path dependency, I kind of compare it to moving through a funnel, where in that first book you're at the wide open aperture, the big end of the funnel, and you don't really have any restrictions on your creative process in terms of how you create the characters and the setting and the plot. And as soon as I started working on the sequel, I was in the middle of that funnel where I was immediately constrained by those decisions that I made that I would have probably thought about differently had I conceptualized the sequel a little bit more before the first book. So you're confronted with all those decisions about the characters and the setting. You can't really go back and fundamentally change those aspects of the things you did in the first book. And so that definitely made it challenging. And the other thing that I found challenging too is that I really wanted the second book to be a standalone title. It was part of a series, hopefully a 3-book series. But at the same time, I wanted a new reader to be able to come into the second book without having read the first book and still enjoy it and get something out of it. So from a structural standpoint, I found that really challenging, figuring out how much of the backstory I needed to tell, how much of it I had to tell without kind of overburdening the second book with just a retelling of the first. So in some respects easier, in some respects much harder to work on that sequel. And now I'm starting to think about the third and final book, and I'm even further along in that funnel where I'm really, really constrained by the decisions I made in the previous 2 books.
Well, real quick, for those who maybe aren't familiar with your first book, do you mind giving us just a quick rundown of War Under the Mango Tree so people know that they can come into the store and get both?
Yeah, so it was a satirical novel set in a fictional country in Africa, and it kind of really revolved around this central character, Don Sliker, who was a defense contractor who made his living off the spoils of war, and his scheming with the regime to help them solve a problem with a renegade warlord. And everyone is playing everyone else, and there's a lot of geopolitical intrigue. But at the end of the day, there was a lot of questions about what was really done. And then a lot of it involved this defense contractor bringing a drone, a UAV, in to solve this problem by targeting this warlord. And at the end of the book, it was revealed that what the people were seeing through the camera of the drone was very different from what was happening on the ground. And it was a little bit unclear whether this warlord was actually ever killed. But the main purpose was really profit, political corruption. So it's kind of just a statement a little bit about superpower politics and how we impose a lot of influence on some of the countries where we operate due to kind of our significant military, political, and economic power. So that's kind of the underlying premise of the first book. And then I developed one character in that first book, a guy named Louis, who was an African army officer serving in that country. And his character emerged more towards the end of the book, and I really wanted to do more with him. He had some interesting relationships. His uncle was the Minister of Defense for this country, and he had a complicated relationship with his uncle. Also a complicated relationship with the legacy of his father, who was a great war hero in this country and had a legacy, and everyone. He was very, very famous personality in the country, but he was killed when Louis was very young. And so also kind of grappling with his legacy, his father's legacy, and how he's dealing with that. And then also a love interest that developed towards the end of the book, where Louis met an American academic who was working in the country. So I wanted to bring those issues forward into the second book and kind of resolve some of those questions that were left unanswered at the end of the first book.
Okay. So that actually leads into a question that I always love to ask. Do you have any favorite characters or ones that hold a special place in your heart?
Well, I really have the most fun developing the jerks. And in the first book, that was Don Sliker, this defense contractor who, his only loyalty was to the bottom line, and he really didn't have many scruples, and no moral compass whatsoever. But those guys are the most fun to satirize. They're the easiest types to caricature. So I really enjoy writing them. And in the second book, there was the CIA agent named Mike Jones, and he likewise was entirely without scruples. He really has no redeeming personality traits whatsoever. And these are not people you would ever want to spend time with at all, but they're great to write. They're fun characters to develop, and they're just a goldmine for satire as well. So they're just enjoyable to write. They're fun.
Yeah. I just want to remind everyone who's on the event with us tonight, if you do have a question, feel free to put it into the chat feature and I can ask it. And then at the end, we'll also open up to you asking questions as well. So were there any specific people or events that inspired the characters and the plot of this book?
So no one specifically. The characters are products of imagination, as is the plot. But certainly, some of my professional experiences really informed, particularly the plot of the second book. A lot of the plot is driven by this interaction between the embassy in this fictionalized country and the White House back in Washington. In about midway through my career, I spent several years working in the White House Situation Room. And so I had this kind of insider view of the national security decision-making process at the highest levels. And I was just a peon kind of making the ship run, but I still got to see a lot during those years that I worked there. And it really informed a lot of my thinking about how I constructed the relationship between the White House and this embassy in the second book. And then after that assignment, I spent several years running military training programs across Africa, where I was providing advisory assistance, training, and equipping African military forces to help with some of their security concerns. So I would run programs all around Africa where we would go in and assist these militaries in getting them ready for UN peacekeeping missions, or training and equipping them to deal with some of their regional security issues, counterterrorism, um, border control, a variety of different security concerns. So I had a lot of opportunity during those years to interact with African Army officers, and certainly learned a lot about their militaries and about the challenges that they had serving in their militaries. So those interactions definitely informed my character development in the second book, and particularly Louis. There's several officers I met during those years where I stole some of those experiences and some of those ideas in developing his character.
Yeah, excellent. So you mentioned drones already, and drone technology plays a big role in both books. And, that's a more current technology than, even just 10 years ago. So why did you decide to use drones as part of the plot line?
Well, during my career, I began my active duty service in the early 90s. And during that time, they were virtually non-existent. The technology, the platforms, it just wasn't used. It very much in its infancy. And that really evolved as a result of 9/11. And from that period on, towards the end of my career, there was just a incredibly rapid evolution of that technology to the point where it was, I would say, one of the dominant collection platforms. I was an intelligence officer, so very critical technology for what we did by the end of my career. So I am really interested in the evolution of that technology, but also the implications for how it's transforming warfare. Now, in my book, it's more of a satirical look at that, because the first book really focused on the fact that what you see through the drone's camera isn't really what's happening on the ground, which is often the case. And the second one looked, the sort of dramatic event in the middle of the book was an attempted assassination attempt by drones, where a small drone loaded with explosives was sent to try to assassinate the president of this country. And a similar event happened to Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. And I swear I had the idea before that attempted assassination. So the idea was stolen from me by those assassins. But it was interesting concept because I hadn't considered it. Among the projects that I worked on when I was in Africa was delivering and training our allied forces on the use of these small unmanned aerial vehicles, because we provided them to many of our allies across Africa. And the idea had occurred to me. I was, I think, in Kenya, and I was working on a program where we were delivering and training small drones to their army. And I was realizing that as we were giving them and preparing them to use them, that we lose control once we turn them over. Once we train them and turn them over, we don't control them. We have no idea what they're going to do with them, how they'll be utilized, probably hopefully in a way that we desire, but not necessarily so. And that's what sort of sparked the idea that one could have been someday used for an assassination or for something of that nature. So that's where some of the ideas came from.
Okay, excellent. Well, we have a question from a member of our audience. Susan just wrote in, and I might be mispronouncing this other person's name, but Essie is wondering if you have writer's block, and if so, how you get past it.
Right. Okay. Essie, thank you for asking. Essie's my daughter, for everyone on the screen knows that. Yeah, I do have writer's block, Essie, and you've probably seen it. So I go out in the yard and walk around, or do something else just like you do. So a good question, though. That's a great question. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, do you find that you really have to walk away from either the computer or the paper? Like, you really do just have to clear your mind because you just can't force it?
Yeah, absolutely. But at the same time, I need to be disciplined because I have a lot of other things going on. And I just have small segments of time when I can devote myself to writing. And one of those times, the majority of the second novel was written in the front seat of my Subaru, sitting there watching the kids' soccer game. So I try to make use of all the time I can. If I can grab an hour and a half of writing time while I'm sitting in the car at soccer practice, then I'll do it and grab that time when I can, because it's precious and you can't let it escape.
Absolutely. So I kind of want to talk too, I've got a couple other questions, but I kind of want to talk about what has been like for you as a first-time published author, going through those steps and kind of seeing the big picture. And you are being published through the company First Steps Publishing. And how has that been?
You know, it was challenging at first. I think I went through some of the struggles that most first-time authors do in terms of trying to find a publisher. I think I probably sent out 50 query letters to agents and publishers. And one thing that helped a lot, and I'll give a plug for Dave Edlin, another local Bend author who I know you know, Julie.
Mm,
So Dave has been a great mentor to me. And when I had the first original manuscript, I just didn't know what to do. And Dave, one of his many specialties, he's a multi-talented individual, but he mentors people on finding publishers on that first step. And so he sat down with me. I reached out to him. He sat down with me, looked at my query letter, helped me massage it a bit, and then more importantly, helped me develop a strategy for looking at potential publishers that were sort of within my league. I mean, I'm not going to, I realize I'm not shooting for the stars. I'm not going for a major publisher. And he helped me think about finding that right fit, about doing the research on the publishers, about the kind of things that they publish, and really coming up with a good strategy for focusing those query letters on companies that would be most likely to respond. So I think I sent out probably 40 or 50 letters. I got maybe 3 or 4 responses, asking for additional pages for different additional chapters, and then finally got an offer with First Steps, which is an Oregon-based small publishing firm out on the coast, and they do great work, and they expressed interest, wanted to see some more, and eventually sent a contract. And that process took 18 months. So
yeah.
it was a long and challenging process to link up with the publisher, and I know that's probably the same case for most writers beginning, just trying to get that break and trying to find someone that wants to work with you.
Absolutely. And I will say this, I love both of the covers. So I have the current book right here in front of me. I don't have a copy of War Under the Mango Tree handy, I apologize. But I think that they've done a very interesting thing with the lack of color that makes the background pop, those negative images. How much, did you have, were there multiple covers for both of the books, or was it like a pretty simple to come up with this? Because it's very eye-grabbing.
Susan Parrott, who runs First Step Publishing, she actually does the graphics herself. She's incredibly talented graphic artist, and she actually designs the covers herself. She's one of her passions, and she's amazing at it. And so we had a little bit back and forth. She asked me for some concepts. So both of the covers originated with some ideas that I generated, and I just was doing some cutting and pasting on some PowerPoint slides, throwing some ideas out. And then she took those ideas and kind of ran with it and created the finished product. So it was a collaborative effort. But she's really amazing in taking these sort of ill-formed ideas that I had on a PowerPoint slide and turning it into something that is really amazing. I mean, she really does fabulous work and is able to capture the essence of the book too, because she takes time to read the book, to understand what's going on there, and to create a cover that I think reflects the content of the book as well.
Yeah. Awesome. So we have another question from the chat. Steve is wondering, do you need to obtain DoD pre-publication review of your novels?
Good question. I hope not. So I do write nonfiction and journal articles more related to what I did in my previous career. And for all of those, anything nonfiction, yes, I do. I have to send that through pre-publication review, specifically some of the recent journal articles that I've written in the past couple of years. Those all have to go through DoD review, and it's a cumbersome, difficult, time-consuming process. For novels, since this is entirely fictional and I'm not revealing any technical details, it's not Tom Clancy-like where I'm delving deep into classified material. I didn't even bother sending it for review, and don't think it would be necessary for something like this.
Okay. Let's see here. What authors have inspired your writing?
I do love political satire, and so I've always been a fan of Joseph Heller and Kurt Vonnegut, Evelyn Waugh, Franz Kafka. So the great satirists, definitely. More recently, there's a guy named Mohammed Hanaf, who's a Pakistani writer who wrote this amazing comic novel that was about the 1988 plane crash of General Muhammad Zia, who was the ruler of Pakistan at the time. And so that also a fabulous comic novel. I also try to read a lot of African writers. Most recently, there's a Congolese novelist, Alan Mabanku, who's fabulous. He wrote a book called Broken Glass, which I really enjoyed, which I read recently. A Nigerian writer named Christopher Obani, who's also really great. I'm looking forward to reading Ya Jessie's second book, which came out recently. She spoke here in Bend a few years ago, and I loved Homegoing, her first book. So I do try to read writers from Africa, and in Ya Jessie's case, Ghanaian American writers as well. So those are the main authors. I also have always enjoyed V.S. Naipaul's writings on Africa. He's written several books on Africa as well.
So, so let me ask this: you you haven't been in the Army for a while, but how am I trying to say this? Do you still need to do research to get a feel of maybe like what's more currently going on to set in the book, or do you really feel like you can use so much of your background to write these characters and scenarios?
Yeah, I do pay a lot of attention still to national security issues and also things going on in Africa. And for this particular book, it is interesting because I developed the concept probably 2 years ago and wrote most of it last year. But a lot of the events, I think, in the preceding year, some of them are coming close to the reality of the book. Obviously, this is satire and it's fiction, but you look. This book starts out with an incident of police brutality that police are beating up some protesters, and that starts off massive protests of a country that's undergoing a severe economic crisis. And that really mirrors very closely what's going on in Nigeria right now, going on in Tanzania, what's going on in Uganda. So there are countries certainly where the current situation reflects some of the realities presented in this book. And not because I have these great powers of prediction, but I do kind of follow general trends. And currently the situation with the economic crisis combined with some of the repression of some of these regimes are creating situations that are not at all dissimilar to what I was depicting in the book.
Okay. So you have mentioned a few of the authors that you've been reading and have inspired, but since I have seen you in the store quite a bit recently, what is some of the stuff that you're currently reading, either fiction or nonfiction?
Yeah, actually, I got to thank you, Julie, because you recommended Peter Stark's book on Astoria, which was fabulous. Last time I was in the store, you told me that said you got to read this book about the two expeditions that went to establish the outpost in Astoria, and that was pretty riveting. That was great. I do enjoy reading history and nonfiction as well. And then I just read a book a few years older by a woman named Sally Denton, who wrote a book on the Bechtel Corporation, which was fascinating as well. Just kind of charting its rise from when they built the Hoover Dam to becoming one of the most powerful corporations in the world, and also one of the most well-connected corporations in the world. So two great books that I just recently read.
Awesome. So you've mentioned that there is going to be a third of the book and you're kind of working on it. Can you give us maybe just a little, snippet of maybe what's going to go on in that book?
Well, we left off the second book with the character Louis. The country is crumbling into chaos, and he's approached by the CIA agent to have a discussion about elections. And it's kind of a dramatic point where the CIA agent reveals to Louis some important information about his father that kind of causes him to see his father in a different light. He, as I mentioned in the first book, his father was a great war hero who died when Louis was very young. He didn't know him very well, and it sort of held him up on a pedestal. And a lot of what Louis did, he left this country to receive his education, then came back to serve in the army, which is not an uncommon phenomenon for African military officers who come from elite families. It's kind of a common trajectory. But in any case, he didn't get to know his father that well and was sort of always trying to live up to his legacy and this image of his father as this great warrior. And at the end of this book, the CIA agent reveals some information to Louis about his father that causes Louis to see him in a different light, kind of leaving off there. And then the mention of elections. And at the end of the book, the dramatic events at the end of the book leave Louis as something of a hero. He protected protesters marching on the presidential mansion as when he could have had an opportunity to take some very different choices. So he ends the book as something of a hero, maybe following in the footsteps of his father, maybe not. So I'd like to resolve some of those issues in the final book, and it will probably deal more with some issues of elections.
Okay. Um, so your background, and you have worked in the White House, and it mentions here the White House Situation Room. And I was struck at the beginning of Operation Hermes. There's a description of the White House Situation Room that sounds like it's a closet, like it's a very small space. So in your experience, the White House Situation Room doesn't look as grand as it does on the West Wing?
No, it doesn't. It's a very small space, and I ran one of the watch teams. So there's five. In order to run the Situation Room 24/7, you have to have 5 different teams that are constantly rotating through to keep the Situation Room manned. I ran one of those teams, and we have a small space, kind of a command center in the back of the Situation Room, and there are 3 conference rooms. The main conference room you always see in pictures, where the president is sitting at the long table. And then there's 2 smaller conference rooms. And the smallest conference room really is about the size of a closet. And it's used for teleconferences, for secure phone calls. And so that depiction was actually based on my recollections of people coming into that closet to make very important phone calls. But it's the last place you want to go. It's very small, very cramped. And it's the president never goes in that room, obviously, but that's where the staff is relegated to when they need to make a secure phone call to one of the embassies or somewhere else in the world.
Well, cool. So that's definitely something new that I learned, because I'm a huge fan of the show The West Wing. So of course I was sitting here thinking, oh, it's this, technologically advanced, huge room that everybody's like going into, which I'm sure, is somewhat true in certain
Yeah, some of it is true. I mean, there
yeah.
is a lot of technology there, but it's a small, cramped, and it's in the West Wing, and it sits right below the Oval Office and the Chief of Staff's office. So, the West Wing itself is very, very small space, and there aren't a lot of places for the president to meet when he has a group, particularly secure places that you could have classified discussions. Really, the Situation Room is the only space in the West Wing where the president can meet and have those kind of discussions. So it is a busy place, but it's not at all big. It's very, very cramped. And when you don't really appreciate the West Wing, the TV show the West Wing itself makes it seem like a big space, lots of people moving around. It's not that big, and there isn't that much room for people to move around. Isn't that much office space. So the Situation Room is busy because it's one of the few places where the president can get his staff together to meet.
We do have a question in the chat. Brigitte is asking if you can tell us who was the president when you were working at the White House.
Yeah, so I worked in the White House from 2009 to 2011. So Barack Obama was the president.
Okay, very cool. Well, I think we can go ahead and open it up now to questions from our audience. So if you're familiar with Zoom, there's a couple different ways that you can kind of get my attention. You can either wave at me through the camera. If you don't have a camera available, again, in the chat feature, you can ask a question. But I'd love to be able to let people ask their questions themselves. So if anyone has one, I can unmute you.
I know everyone's probably really zoomed out, so
right.
There's no questions.
Love Zoom and yet at the same time. Okay, yeah, hold on. I see Butch waving his hand, so go ahead.
How were the Turkish supplied drones, how did they prove to be so effective in the Azerbaijan and Armenia?
Yeah, that's interesting that you brought that up, Butch, because that was certainly when I was thinking about discussing the drones, just thinking about the areas where they have proved pretty decisive recently in terms of the technology changing, the reality of the battlefield. Certainly in Libya, certainly in Yemen, certainly in Syria, and then this recent 40 to 45-day conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. They, according to some estimates, were decisive in terms of how the Azerbaijanis were able to employ those against the Armenian forces. And I've seen a variety of estimates and numbers in terms of the main battle tanks and armored personnel carriers that were destroyed. But they were using some interesting techniques, as I understand, that where they were using some drones just for observation and other drones that were essentially loitering above and then kamikazing in to destroy tanks, which was an interesting technique that I understand was practiced in Syria. So, you have countries that are using technology which may be certainly not as sophisticated as what the U.S. Has, but they're using this technology in very innovative ways that, and in that particular case, appears to have been pretty decisive on the battlefield.
Excellent. I thought I saw another hand up. Maybe not. All right. Well, yeah, if anyone else has questions, please type them into the chat. Glenn, if there's anything else I guess just want us to know about your books, please, the floor is yours.
The only other thing that, that had occurred to me that I thought was kind of interesting, I was doing some research recently just about the relationship between satires and thrillers, because I don't think there's a lot of books in that genre or crossing that genre. And I was going back and looking at Dr. Strangelove, the movie, which I think is probably one of the greatest works of political satire in history. I mean, really, it's fabulous. And I did not realize that Stanley Kubrick, when he was writing the screenplay from that, based it on a straight thriller. It was a guy named Peter George who wrote that thriller. It was called Red Alert. And Stanley Kubrick took that original book, which had no satirical or humorous elements in it, but the storyline was very similar, about a runaway bomber that was sent that couldn't be recalled, that was going to start World War III. So very similar to the plot line in Dr. Strangelove, and he took that, and I think just trying to make it speak more to the age, because that book was written in the end of the 50s, I believe, Red Alert, and then in the mid 1960s when Stanley Kubrick was writing that screenplay. So some things had changed, and I think there was certainly a degree of cynicism about some of the craziness of the Cold War and mutually assured destruction. So he really took that thriller and added that satirical element and turned it into something pretty amazing. So I was thinking there weren't that many books or works that combine those genres, and I was wrong. I mean, that was really a great example, interesting example of how those genres can, I think, combine and make something interesting. And I think there's some qualities of both thrillers and satire, which actually makes them work pretty well together, because these, I think both genres work well when the absurd and the possible kind of hew closely together, and they come very closely together. So both thrillers and satire share that quality. So that was my only other thing I think we were talking about, is that issue of the thriller and satire. But no, otherwise, thank you everyone for coming. I really appreciate it. I know
I think we have one more.
On a Friday night is the last thing everyone wanted to do. So thank you very much.
That's great. Scott, did you have a question?
Yeah. Hey, Glenn. Just a quick question, since I understand why satire as your preferred mode of sort of literary expression, but would you ever branch out of that into, you were talking about thrillers or military history, sort of fiction and military history, different setting. I know satire is sort of a natural ground for you, just because I've known you for 49 years, but just curious.
Well, I'm really a frustrated historian. I was trained as a historian, and that was my first love. And I, dropped out of a PhD program and never followed up. And but I would like to go back and someday write a history, more of a popular history, not something that I think I was my interest in history was strangled to death by being forced to write academic history, which is very different than writing popular history. So someday I would love to go back and find that inspiring topic to write a small history. I just got to find the topic. So if anyone has any ideas, let me know.
Well, once again, I want to thank everybody for being here. Thank you to our author. This is the current book. We have War Under the Mango Tree in stock as well. So feel free to come in and get both. give us a call if you have any questions. I do want to remind everyone that we have a really fun event happening tomorrow here on Zoom, This Land of Snow, and then we've got some really great ones coming up in December. So please stick with us on Zoom. We hope to see everyone's lovely faces in person again, but until it's safe to do so, we're going to stick to this virtual space. And make sure to get your holiday shopping done early, because we don't want to have books miss any deadlines with shipping, with everything that's going on. So that's it. Thank you for being supporters of Roundabout Books, for our local authors, and you know, just being wonderful.
Thank you, Julie. That was great. Enjoyed it.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Thanks.